My grandpa had one hell of a war. He turned 18 in December of '43, got drafted almost right away, then landed in France sometime in the fall of '44. His outfit was some kind of supply company that operated to the rear of the front line, so he didn't see much actual fighting. All he did was load trucks, drive someplace, and then unload them. Then just a few months later, the leader of Deutschland, as you know him, blew his brains out. The war was over, but my grandpa's service was not, and instead of heading home like a lot of the battle-hardened infantry units, Grandpa stayed in Germany and continued to load trucks. Then one day, some high-ranking officers showed up at my grandpa's unit and starts asking where he is. My grandpa's name was Murphy. He's Irish, but only on my great-grandpa's side. His mother had been a German immigrant and had spoken a heck of a lot of the old language around him when he was a kid. So much so that despite not being able to speak German, he could sure as heck understand it. There was such a demand for translators at the time that Army intelligence was searching up anyone of even the slightest German heritage in hopes that they'd be able to help translate documents or interpret conversations. But then, in the case of my grandpa, he was given a very different kind of task. When he'd confirmed that my grandpa could understand enough German to be of use to him, the officer told him to get into his jeep, then off they drove to some intelligence unit where my grandpa and a bunch of other soldiers could get a short briefing. Long story short, they were to pose as guards in various prisoner-of-war camps, but their real job was to just listen. Anyone higher than a private first class was to receive a very temporary demotion, and each of them was to master the art of looking very bored and very dumb. My grandpa said the first part was easy, because for the most part, German POWs talked about the same crap American soldiers did. They complained about the latrines, about the food, and about each other, all very inoffensive stuff. Then one by one, depending on the kind of stuff that they'd been up to during the war, they were either hanged, forced into labor battalions, or given their freedom. My grandpa said that over the months that followed, his camp's population kept shrinking and shrinking until there were rumors that they were going to close the place down altogether. Then one day, hundreds of these SS guerrillas marched right up to the camp's gates, flying this big old white flag, and asked to surrender. Turns out this rogue unit of Germany's most loyal bodyguards had been hiding out in the woods for months, and when they weren't taking pot shots at Americans, they were terrorizing the local Germans for collaborating with the U.S. Friendly forces had been trying to starve the rogue unit out for a while, so they figured their surrender was simply a natural result of their efforts. There was just one problem. The camp's guard contingency had been scaled down as the number of prisoners began to dwindle, meaning that by the time these SS guys showed up, there were 8 prisoners for every 1 American camp guard. At first, the camp's commander was somehow completely fine with this and saw it was an opportunity to prove how just a handful of American boys could keep a lid on hundreds of rabid SS. But he was wrong, and if it hadn't been for my grandpa, a lot of people would have paid with their lives. Grandpa said that one day he was on guard duty when, for the first time during his whole stay at the POW camp, he heard something that sounded vaguely suspicious. All these hardened SS prisoners had been on their best behavior. Not a single one had stepped out of line. But then after my grandpa overhears one say to another, "How much longer will we have to wait?" which was a fairly common question among the prisoners, the other replied, "Warten auf das Signal," which means, "We wait for the signal." Now obviously, my grandpa is thinking, what signal? But he had also been explicitly ordered to report anything like that to his superiors. Words like plan, plot, or code, these were all things that were of great interest because the main goal by that point was to prevent war criminals from escaping or destroying evidence of their crimes. But signal, that was something else entirely. The second his superiors heard about someone throwing the word signal around, they flooded the camp with extra guards, then got my grandpa to point out the soldiers that he'd heard use it. Sometime later, I imagine after an extensive period of interrogation, one of the SS guys finally talks and gives up their whole crazy plan. You see, all these SS fanatics might have showed up flying a white flag, but They hadn't really surrendered. Like I mentioned, they'd been hiding out in the area for months, following out Germany's final order to fight to the bitter end, but they never hit the POW camp on account of it being full of Germans. They also never opted to mount any kind of prison break, but by that time, that was neither here nor there, I guess. And so one day, a few SS scouts snuck up to the camp and happened to notice that there was only a handful of prisoners, but more importantly, only about 24 camp staff and guards. They reported this back to their commander, who came up with an extremely fiendish plan: fake a surrender, overwhelm the camp guards, then loot weapons and ammo to continue their partisan struggle against the Americans. But the SS didn't just want weapons and ammo. Oh no, they had a much bigger prize in mind, and that prize was American uniforms. If they could disguise themselves as Americans in unblemished uniforms, the SS could mount devastating attacks on our boys, especially if you had an SS soldier disguised as, say, an American officer, of which there were plenty of the camp staff. By overhearing that word signal and bringing it to the attention of his superiors, my grandpa saved countless lives. So many, in fact, that his superiors sought to award him a Bronze Star. I thought they only gave those things out for combat-related heroism. Turns out they award them for other things too. They just gotta be real significant kinds of things to be worth considering. The whole thing made him a minor celebrity among the boys he served with, and around 6 months later, he was discharged and sent home. My grandpa never considered himself a hero. He always said that he was simply doing his job. But I got the medal and the citation that proves that he saved, and I quote, scores, if not hundreds of lives. And to me, that's just about plain a definition of a hero as it's possible to get.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
But last autumn, my dad gave me something that he'd been keeping hold of that would spark off something of an interest in the First World War. It was the 11th of November, Armistice Day, when my dad walked into my room and handed me a small leather-bound book that looked like it was 100 years old. But I suppose that's because it was, in fact, even older than that. He told me to be very, very delicate with it because it was a family heirloom and incredibly precious. The kind of thing that could easily find its way into a museum one day, but instead, we kept it as a close reminder of how our family had a close connection to one of the most horrific events in world history. Before that, history was something of an abstract concept, something that dead old man did that had little bearing on my own life. But in that moment, I realized it was just as flesh and blood as I was, since my family had a deep connection with it, that it was just as much a part of me as it was for them. My dad explained that the little book was a diary kept by my great-great-granddad, who had fought with Northumberland-Fusier in the Battle of the Pressing during the First World War. And since it was Armistice Day, that it was a perfect time to get me to get acquainted with that. But as I said, it wasn't just an account of his experiences in World War I. It was a record of how he had been present at one of the darkest episodes in the history of humanity. It was the 22nd of April, 1915. Just after dawn this morning, the Germans opened up with a very heavy torrent. It was a lot of rifle bullets at first, pinging over our heads as he got down in the trenches. But then, we heard the machine gun fire, kicking off this clacker, clacker, clacker. The bullets whizzing over our heads. We didn't know what they were trying to hit. All that fire seemed like a waste of bullets, and despite all the racket, we actually laughed at how we seemed to have been sent to face a division of blind Germans. But as it turned out, they were all part of their horrible plan to get us as low down in the trenches as they could, to be fodder for what came next. Once the fire had pettered out, I took a little look over the trench to make sure that there were no German stormtroopers rushing our trenches to toss bombs inside. But just before I did, I heard the strangest noise coming from no man's land, like a kind of sizzling you might expect to hear from a pan of frying bacon or the like. Then, when I finally looked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was like a yellowy green wall of mist approaching our position, thick and heavy, almost clinging to the ground, had rolled across, and it was ginormous, at least 20 feet up in the air. I really do mean it was like a great wall approaching us. There was absolutely no escaping it. We had no earthly idea what it was that was approaching us, but it put the fear of God into us regardless, and it began to roll over us. That's when men started to choke. I started coughing and sputtering, this thick, mucousy saliva cascading from our lips, my eyes burning, and my nostrils did to any bit of exposed fleshy skin the stuff touched turned to burn horribly. I didn't quite see it at the time, but some men tried to escape the cloud of death by lying down in the trenches, which was definitely not the right thing to do, as it was heavier than air and concentrated near the ground. Those who tried that were suffocated, where they lay snuffed out, something we had absolutely no understanding of. We had no form protection from it. All we could really do was wet out handkerchiefs in the muddy water at the bottom of the trench and put it over our mouths, same as you do to stop yourself from inhaling smoke. We were ordered to hold her position at first, but after a few minutes, even the officers and other parts of the trench more badly hit than us started to run from the gas. In the end, we had to escape the trenches and ran back towards the mine and road. There you could see these chaps just laying there, gasping for breath, and they were dying in one of the worst ways imaginable. But worse for us was that we had absolutely no idea how to alleviate their suffering. It was so confusing that one of our sergeants took this big jar of Vaseline and started applying it inside the throats of some of these poor young blokes. It didn't help, of course, but I think the point was to help him feel like he was doing something, anything, to help the poor buggers. And my God, the state of them that were swelling up, swelling and changing colors. They asphyxiated on their own lung fluid, just rows and rows of men, turning purple and blue, before they died. Some others that had only breath and a little were desperately trying to drink muddy water from ditches at the side of the road. That didn't do them any good. It just made them sicker. Our eyes were streaming with tears, burning like the devil. But luckily for me, I could still see. There was nothing we could do for those that were blinded, but they needed some kind of comfort. Something to at least give them an idea that their wounds couldn't be treated. All we had were rows of bandages from our first aid kit, which we carried in the corner of our tunic. So we unrolled the bandages and wrapped them around the heads of those that were blinded, before we marched back towards a plan for treatment. I was put at the head of the column of 10 or 12 blind men, each with a hand on their shoulder of the man in front. Or you could see around you was columns of blind men being led back from the front lines. It was truly haunting. But perhaps the most haunting part was that on our way back, we marched near the riverbank. It was there that I saw hundreds of bodies floating in the water. Men had gone down into the river, trying to drink the water to soothe the burning in their throats. Then they died in the water because of the bloating effect of the gas. They just floated up to the surface and started floating downstream. It was a river of bodies, and it's an image I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live. I have to go roll call soon to see just how many are left, but I don't think there are many at all. God help those of us that are well enough to carry on the fight, because I know we'll have to face this news and terrible threat again, and soon. That's all there is in that particular section of his diary regarding the Battle of the Pira. But I sat there and read it in one more sitting, totally engrossed. I had no idea I had a family member that had been involved in something so utterly terrifying, something that I think would have driven me mad if I had been forced to witness it. Reading that diary was more terrifying than any Stephen King novel I've read, because I know it was real. I know the river bodies was actually a real thing and not drawn from the imagination of some dumb writer. After that, I couldn't stop reading about World War I, knowing my great-great-grandfather was a part of it. A lot of it is pure horror, but nothing disturbed me as much as reading about the first gas attack. I'm sure you all agree. Being subjected to that sort of new and terrifying technology would have truly been hell on earth.
My grandpa used to work as a stevedore over in Savannah, and he'd tell us all kinds of stories from his time on the job. Like one time, they got a whole shipment of bananas from the Philippines or somewhere, and back in those days they'd transport the bananas still attached to the big old branches that they grew on. They'd pop the crate and then carefully pull the bananas out wearing real thick pairs of gloves, and they wore those gloves because of the tarantulas. The tarantulas didn't eat the bananas, but other, smaller, creepy crawlies would, making the banana branches a prime feeding ground for them. Most of the time, the workers over on the other side of the ocean would do their best to get all the bugs off their produce, but every so often, a tarantula would tuck itself away among the bunches after getting its fill of bugs, and then survive the entire transit process from whatever tropical islands that they were from to the ports of the United States. My grandpa said that one time he was working with this guy popping crates of bananas when the guy started to get a little too comfortable. He starts getting slow, talking when he should have been working, and then the next thing, Grandpa's turning around to see this guy's arm deep in a crate, but looking back at Grandpa trying to talk to him and paying no mind to what he was doing. Grandpa said that the second he turned around, he saw this huge, hairy spider just slowly wandering up the guy's arm, biggest thing he'd ever seen during all those years on the job. The guy couldn't feel it because of the big, thick, elbow-length glove that they used to wear to prevent spider bites and whatnot. Grandpa freezes, scared out of his wits, and then just points at the thing crawling up the guy's arm. Only then does the guy actually pay attention to what he's doing. But by then, it was too late. He sees the spider, then lets out this almighty yelp of terror, but this only succeeds in freaking the spider out too. I'm guessing the thing just kind of reacted on instinct and moved to neutralize the threat, so to speak. And still, instead of just jumping off his arm or something, the tarantula runs up the guy's sleeve, then makes this crazy leap right at the guy's face. Grandpa said that the guy's second scream, the one he did when the tarantula hit his face, was just about the loudest and most terrifying noise he'd ever heard. It was like a death scream or something, like the kind of sound a person can only make when they're in fear for their lives. Grandpa said that he did the first thing that came to mind, which was grab something to try and whack the spider off the guy's face. He grabbed a broom and then turned to run back over to his coworker, but saw that he'd already batted the spider off of him and was running for the door of the warehouse. They get outside, slam the door behind them, and Grandpa's checking if the guy is okay when he sees these two big puncture marks on the guy's lower cheek from where the spider had bit him. Again, Grandpa is dumbstruck with fright, and all he can do is quietly point towards where this guy's been bit. I think maybe he just didn't know that he had been bitten, maybe from the adrenaline or what have you, but a moment later, the guy puts a hand to his face and realizes that he's been bitten, and then promptly passes out. Grandpa thought that the guy was dead. He thought the spider's venom had gone straight to the guy's brain and killed him dead in an instant. But then, the same deadly spider is now loose in one of the warehouses, so Grandpa goes running off to warn everyone that his coworker was dead and that there'd be more deaths if they didn't get the hell out of the area. He starts screaming at everyone to run for their lives because some deadly spider just jumped out of a crate and killed the guy he was working with. And this causes a full-blown panic on the docks, with half the guys running to save their skins and the other half organizing impromptu hunting parties so they could track the spider down and kill it. In truth, the guy who had been bitten wasn't dead at all, he just passed out, like I said. But then the area around the bite got so swollen and red so fast, that even though the guy woke up and started wandering around, confused, it didn't really do much to calm the situation down. The reality was that even though the bites from the spider were very nasty, they weren't even close to deadly. But since this was like the late 50s or something, there was no Discovery Channel back then, and folks just kind of assumed that every tropical tarantula had a bite that could kill a man stone dead in mere minutes. You had all these stevedores running around with just about any kind of weapon they could get their hands on until finally one of the bosses got wind of what was going on. He shut the place down for the night, called in animal control, and they sent a guy over to find and trap the spider before they took it over to some museum or something for identification. The guy who got bit spent the night in the hospital and then was back at work just a few days later. We always enjoyed hearing that story, but the thing is, that wasn't even the scariest or craziest story my grandpa had from his time as a stevedore. He'd always break the spider story out for the younger crowd at family gatherings, and after miming all the spider stuff with his fingers of one hand, he'd almost always have all the little girls running off in disgust while all the little boys sat around him, completely enraptured by the tale of an encounter with a great hairy monster. But then, after they'd all gone to bed or their parents had taken them home, he'd break out the wilder stories for the adults. Most of these consisted of things like fellas sneaking their girlfriends onto the job with them, then getting caught catching 7 minutes in heaven together in a back office or shipping container, or the time they stole a whole crate of scotch because they realized that there was a mistake on one of the shipping manifests. The right call would have been to simply correct the manifest, but nope. Almost $5,000 worth of luxury scotch went poof and disappeared, and everyone had a very Merry Christmas that year. But then on one occasion, he told us a straight-up horror story. Back during his first year of being a stevedore, my grandpa worked with this guy called Crazy Al. Al was a war veteran, as in he was in the Army during World War II. The guys on the docks knew that he served in the Pacific Islands, and they knew that he'd seen some pretty messed up stuff too, but that was it. No one ever asked Crazy Al about the stuff that he'd seen or where he'd fought because no one wanted to upset him, and no one wanted to upset him because, like I said, he's Crazy Al. My grandpa said everyone felt for the guy, but that he wasn't particularly popular neither, on account of him being almost impossible to work with. Crazy Al couldn't be around loud noises, and woe betide anyone who accidentally startled him, so instead of working the warehouses and whatnot like the rest of the workers, Grandpa said Crazy Al was kept in the equipment room, where folks went to get tools, slings, safety gear, and things of that nature. You just didn't walk in either. You knocked really softly on the door till Al came to ask you what you wanted, and that way, he was kept at a safe distance from everyone else. Anyway, one day the docks get this big old cargo ship coming in, only right away they can tell something is different about it, because some of the containers had different kinds of letters on them. It turns out, the ship had come all the way from South Korea, and since the country was rebuilding from the war at that time, I figured this was one of the first Korean ships to dock in America for quite a while. So the ship docks, and these two Korean officers walked down the gangplank to greet the foreman in perfect English. They exchanged a few words, discussed the unloading of their ship, then off they went back to their quarters while the stevedores got to work. Sometime later, Crazy Al comes out of the equipment shed for some reason. Someone later said that they saw him walk out, and when he saw the ship floating in the dock, he just stopped and stared at it, like he was hypnotized or something. According to my grandpa, this person mentioned Crazy Al's episode to one of his coworkers, but since Al had more than earned his nickname by that point, it was kind of like, what else is new? And so the last people saw of Al, he was marching across the dock with a crowbar in hand, heading straight for the gangplank of the Korean ship. Then the next thing, everyone on the dock started to hear screaming coming from it. And there are screams and shouts all in Korean, and from the sounds of things, it was like they were having some kind of fight up there. Then the next thing, gunshots. And so everyone scatters and the cops get called. Everyone's still sort of hiding out, keeping an eye on the ship when the cops show up and run aboard with their guns drawn. And there, they find Crazy Al, shot to death with a crowbar in his hand. Then in the vicinity were 2 dead Koreans beat to death by Al and about half a dozen wounded Korean soldiers, one of which had shot Crazy Al dead with a gun that they kept on board for emergencies. For years, everyone kind of figured that Al had mistaken the Koreans for Japanese, which is obviously one of the 2 countries we were at war with while Al was serving as a soldier. But the truth is much more disturbing. You see, as it turned out, Al had been a prisoner in a Japanese POW camp, a particularly brutal one too. He'd seen his fellow soldiers tortured, executed, and slowly worked to death over the course of 2 to 3 years. He learned to hate the camp's guards, but not all of them were Japanese. Part of Japan's conquest of Asia included the Korean peninsula, and they gave a lot of Koreans a chance to prove their loyalty to their new masters by serving as guards in their prisoner of war camps. Then, to prove just how fanatically loyal they really were, they treated American POWs way crueler than the Japanese did, as a way of winning over their new masters. And Crazy Al probably had his very own Korean camp guard, and I'm not saying it could possibly excuse what he did to those poor sailors, but it certainly explains why he turned so murderous just at the sight of them. The thing is, folks just carried on thinking Al was crazy. Couldn't tell the difference between Korean and Japanese, they'd say. Stupid old Crazy Al, crazier than a poop house rat. But then, it seems to me and my grandpa that Al wasn't all that crazy after all. Sure, he was disturbed, but there's a chilling kind of clarity to him choosing to take vengeance like that. The way my grandpa tells it, he was just quiet. He didn't run across the docks, screaming and cursing, waving his crowbar around. He just walked, all cool and calm, to try and commit a massacre without saying a word. And that little detail never fails to creep me out.
In the early 20th century, Markia Sarenko escaped from her home country of Russia, feeling the bloodthirsty Bolsheviks who were in the process of turning their native land into the political wasteland that was the USSR. She escaped over the border to China, who at the same time had yet to be consumed by communism as a temporary stopover on her way to the United States. However, it was in China that the superstitious Maria consulted a fortune teller, wishing to get a good idea of what her journey had in store for her. The Chinese fortune teller gave Maria some very good news indeed, telling her that not only would she successfully make it to the United States, but that she would give birth to a daughter whose beauty would become globally renowned. But that under all circumstances, she should avoid so-called dark waters. Then, after making it all the way to San Francisco, Maria gave birth to a daughter on July 20th, 1938, naming her Natalia Nikolaevna Zarenko. Natalia would gain the fame that the fortune teller had predicted, but would be known by another name entirely. That name was Natalie Wood. Natalie's mother essentially groomed her for stardom from the time she learned to walk and talk. She sent her to singing, dancing, and acting lessons, training her to be a complete triple threat, before parading her around movie studios in the hopes that she would be discovered, and thus fulfill her destiny. It was such an intensive experience that it verged on abuse. Natalia's mother was utterly ruthless and unforgiving, separating her from her sister and even denying her medical assistance for injuries in the instance that this would only make her stronger. Maria paid close attention to the prophetic warnings of the fortune teller, too, and made an effort to give Natalia a deep ingrained fear of deep water. Yet, despite her efforts, the fortune teller's predictions almost came true on the set of a movie called The Green Promise. During shooting, a young Natalie was set to run across a bridge that was set to collapse during a rainstorm, a bridge that just so happened to run over a pool of rough, dark water. The director insisted that the timing would be just right, and although there would be an element of on-screen peril, she would be entirely safe, but terrifyingly enough, one of the set stuff happened to pull the collapse mechanism too early, and Natalie broke her wrist as she fell into the water. Her mother was distraught, believing she was about to see the prophecy of drowning come true before her very eyes. But the set staff, acting quickly, helped Natalie pull herself to safety as she struggled to do so with a broken wrist. If she wasn't terrified of water beforehand, she certainly was then. Maria refused to get her daughter any medical assistance for the broken wrist either, believing that an insistence on doing so would deter directors from hiring her in the future. The injury scarred her wrist so heavily that Natalie went on instead on covering the scars with multiple bracelets for the rest of her life. Not only because she believed the wound was ugly, because it reminded her of one of the most traumatic instances of her life, so traumatic that she never, ever learned to swim, and was reported to have panic attacks whenever she tried to wash her hair. Despite her traumas, Natalie had a long and successful film career, and will go on to wed fellow star Robert Wagner. They had a rocky relationship, and naturally got divorced and remarried before having their one and only daughter, Natasha. Then, during Thanksgiving weekend of 1981, Natalie Roberts and another movie star, Christopher Walken, were enjoying some rest and relaxation aboard Wagner's yacht, named the Splendor, around the Catalina Island off the coast of California. Only one other person was with them, the boat's captain, a man named Dennis Davern. They spent the weekend shopping, sunning themselves, sailing, dining out, and profusely drinking on the night of November 27, 1981, after yet another evening of heavy drinking. An argument between Natalie and Robert broke out when it grew so intense that Natalie demanded that Captain Davern take her ashore on the small dinghy that was kept on board the Splendor. The pair then spent the night in a hotel before returning to the boat the following morning, when Natalie and Robert apparently talked things out and buried the hatchet. The following night, Robert, Natalia, Captain Davern, and Christopher Walken went ashore to dine in a restaurant called Doug's Harbor Reef. Here, they continued their stint of heavy drinking, reportedly ordering 2 bottles of wine, 2 bottles of champagne, and numerous daiquiris, with one of the waiting staff reporting that they barely touched their food. The proper people were so intoxicated that the restaurant manager reportedly called harbor security to ensure that they made it back to the boat safely that night. According to Captain Davern, Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken argued violently over politics, as well as the direction that Natalie's career should take. He has since stated that the argument grew so violent that one of the men threw an empty wine bottle at the other before Natalie had to get involved to separate the pair. The argument then shifts to one between Natalie and Robert, with Natalie apparently telling Robert that she'd had enough before retiring to her room for the night at around 3:30 a.m. The next morning, on November 29th of 1981, a ship-to-shore call was made from the Splendor, one in which Captain Davern reported to the U.S. Coast Guard that Natalie Wood was missing. A search begins, one that ended just a few hours later at around 8 a.m., when Natalie Wood's drowned body is found floating near the ship's inflatable dinghy, the very same one she had used to escape the boat just 2 days prior. She was wearing nothing but a nightgown, a pair of socks, and a jacket. The autopsy showed that she had a blood alcohol content of 0.14%, almost double the legal limit for driving. There was also evidence that she had taken a rather large amount of powerful painkillers, and the time before her death. She was just 43 years old when she passed away. Amazingly, on the day she died, Robert Wagner is not intensively questioned by police. It's only a few days later that the 3 men who were on the boat that night are brought in for questioning, and when they are each tells us suspiciously similar stories that details the evening's events. As a result, Natalie's death was assumed to be nothing more than an accidental drowning. The nation was dumbstruck by such a horrible, unforeseeable tragedy, and mourned in tandem with Robert Wagner, who went on to raise their 2 daughters as a single parent. 2 daughters who are almost inconsolable, distraught at the sudden death of their beloved mother,
Natalie's death seemed to remain an open and shut case for an entire 30 years, until a shocking revelation turned public attention back onto the situation. Captain Dennis Davern, the man who had been captaining the Splendor that night, broke his silence on the case and came forward to state that he had in fact lied to the investigating law enforcement. The nation was shocked to hear that the argument that night between Walken and Wagner had not actually been rooted in politics, but the suspicion that Walken had been secretly flirting with Natalie whenever Robert Wagner's back was turned. As was previously mentioned, the argument then shifted to one between Wagner and Natalie after Walken that retired to his room. But then, when Natalie had tried to do the same and retire to bed, Robert Wagner had followed her to continue the argument. Then, sometime later, Wagner stormed up to Captain Davern, sweating and panicking, and told him to turn off all the boat's lights and ignore all onshore calls that came into the boat. In the aftermath, Davern claimed that Wagner kept him confined to his quarters in order to prevent him from giving a statement to the police, then held an impromptu meeting in which he ordered Walken and Davern to keep quiet about the arguments and to essentially give false statements to the police. In light of such statements, police reopened the investigation into Natalie Wood's death in the year 2012. A re-examining of the information gleaned from her autopsy had one corner declaring that she had died as a result of drowning, but also from other undetermined factors. Then, in 2018, Wagner was officially named as a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death. Natalie's sister Alana came out and gave a media interview, stating that she believed Captain Davern's claims to be true, and had even confronted Wagner on the day of Natalie's funeral in an attempt to get him to reveal what had actually happened that night. This culminated in an appearance on the popular TV show Dr. Fell, in which Lena and Davern publicly accused Wagner of being solely responsible for Natalie's death. However, Lana was keen to make it clear that she didn't believe it to be outright murder, and that she didn't believe Wagner ever really intended to kill his wife, but either because lost in his rage during a heat-in-the-moment decision, possibly denying Natalie help when she had fallen into the water while trying to leave the boat to go ashore, just as she had done just 2 nights previous. Despite the accusations from her sister, Natalie's 2 daughters, Natasha and Courtney, stand by their father's version of events, saying he had done all he could to preserve the mother's legacy. Courtney is not even Robert's biological daughter, but adores him so much that she has even taken on his surname, potentially is a sign of loyalty and respect. She personally believes and has publicly stated that Captain Davern is a fabricator, one who simply wishes to make a name for himself, exploiting her mother's death for monetary gain, and these claims do carry some weight to them. For example, Davern not only took 30 years to come forward with his accusations, but was also, by his own admission, extremely drunk on the night in question. His story is apparently changed multiple times throughout the years, leaking seedy gossip to tabloid journalists the entire time. He had also written a book about the events of the night in question, one which has been analyzed and debunked by numerous people who asserted that Davern's version of events are extremely spurious. When asked about Devon's claims, Robert's biological daughter, Natasha, was reportedly said he is somebody who I cannot even dignify with a response because he is so undignified. As for Christopher Walken, the only other person aboard the Splendor that evening, he hasn't spoken much at all about the incident, keeping suspiciously quiet over the years. When asked about how he felt regarding the reopening of the case, he reportedly said, "I don't know," having previously said that he firmly believed Natalie's death to be a tragic accident. In conclusion, it's not entirely out of the question that an extremely intoxicated Natalie might have tried to use the very same dinghy she had used a few nights previous, and doing so, she could have simply fallen into the water and drowned while the other people on board were either too drunk to respond to her cries or simply below deck and unable to hear her entirely. Yet, it's also scarcely feasible that a jealous husband had discovered her infidelities, either perceived or real, thrown her into the sea in a rage, and simply used his influence or outright threats to cover up the murder. It has been 39 years since Natalie's tragic death, and we are still no closer to knowing the entire truth as to what happened to her that night. And it's not only her family and friends that deserve concrete answers, but society as a whole. Have we had a murderer walking among the Hollywood elite for the past 40 years or so? Or has an innocent man been subjected to a campaign of slander when he should have been given room to heal? Whatever happened that Thanksgiving weekend, one thing is painfully clear, that the dark prophecy told to Maria Zakharhenko by the Chinese fortune teller in the early 20th century did actually come true. And it was indeed dark waters that became the undoing of the young woman who came to be known to the world as Natalie Wood.